Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Leah Kaler and today we are going to have our lecture on psychopathy. We are going to start by talking about the early concepts and historical context around psychopathy. If we go all the way back to 1801 and we think about the early term moral insanity, this was introduced in the early 19th century to describe individuals who exhibited severe behavioral abnormalities or lack of moral sense, but without the clear signs of what was then considered insanity, like delusions or hallucinations. This term was used to explain criminal behavior or extreme antisocial actions that did not fit traditional psychiatric diagnoses. So, some key figures back then: British psychiatrist James Cowles Pritchard is often credited with popularizing this term, moral insanity, in his 1835 work, A Treatise on Insanity and Other Disorders Affecting the Mind. Pritchard described moral insanity as a condition where individuals showed a profound disregard for social norms and morality despite having intact intellectual abilities. So if we move on, the next term we're going to talk about is psychopastiche. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And this is a less commonly referred to in the literature of forensic psychology. It generally refers to the blending or amalgamation of different psychological or psychopathic traits into a composite or hybrid condition. It's not a standardized or widely recognized concept of moral insanity or psychopathy. The idea behind psychopastiche might be to describe cases where individuals exhibit a mixture of traits or characteristics from different psychological disorders or conditions which don't neatly fit into traditional diagnostic criteria. And by the 1920s, it had become overly inclusive and eventually synonymous with psychopathy. Then, if we move on, psychopathy, as it is understood today, began to take shape in the early 20th century. The term psychopath was used to describe individuals with a specific set of personality traits and behavioral patterns that included a lack of empathy, superficial charm, and manipulative behavior. This was a shift from the broader and somewhat vague notion of moral insanity to what we see today. So we would be remiss if we didn't talk about Cleckley, and we're going to talk about him much more in today's lecture. In the 1940s, psychiatrist Hervey Cleckley made significant contributions to the understanding of psychopathy with his book, The Mask of Sanity. Cleckley described psychopathy as a personality disorder characterized by superficial charm, a lack of empathy, and manipulative behavior, but with an outward appearance of normalcy. In the 1970s, Robert Hare developed the Psychopathy Checklist, the PCL-R, and we're going to talk about that at length today. That's a diagnostic tool that had become central in forensic psychology for assessing psychopathy. Hare's work provided an understanding of psychopathy and provided a way to evaluate individuals based on specific behavioral and personality traits. So first, let's talk about Cleckley's criteria. We mentioned this earlier. Hervey Cleckley, his criteria for psychopathy was outlined in his seminal work, The Mask of Sanity from 1941, were groundbreaking in shaping the modern understanding of psychopathy. Cleckley's criteria focused on the personality traits and behaviors of individuals he identified as psychopaths. His work laid the groundwork for later diagnostic tools like Robert Hare's Psychopathy Checklist, the PCL-R. So let's talk a little bit about Cleckley's psychopath. So here we can see some of Cleckley's original profile for a psychopath. So we're briefly going to touch upon these, and then we're going to get deeper and deeper as we go into our lecture here today. So some of the early ideas about what psychopathy looked like were a person who has superficial charm and good intelligence, that they don't have delusions or other signs of irrational thinking. They don't have nervousness or other neurotic manifestations. They're very unreliable. They're insincere. They lack remorse or shame. They are inadequately motivated. They've got poor judgment. They are not able to learn by experience. If suicide is talked about, it's very rarely ever carried out. There is a pathological egocentricity. They are not able to love others. There's a general poverty of any type of major affective capacity. There's a loss of insight. They are not responsive to interpersonal relationships. They have very fantastic and uninviting behavior. Their sex life is very impersonal and promiscuous, and they really don't have a life plan that they are following. Cleckley's criteria was influential in shaping the understanding of psychopathy. He emphasized the complex interplay of personality traits and behaviors that characterize psychopathy, providing a framework for later research and clinical practice. This is where Robert Hare, his work comes into play, particularly his book, Without Conscience, The Disturbing World of Psychopaths Among Us from 1993. It's been foundational in advancing the understanding of psychopathy. His research led to the development of the Psychopathy Checklist, the PCL-R. It is a diagnostic tool used to assess psychopathy. In his work, Hare categorizes psychopathy into three broad groups of symptoms, which are interpersonal, affective, and behavioral. So now we're going to take a closer look, starting with interpersonal symptoms. These symptoms reflect how psychopaths interact with others and their way of manipulating and controlling social relationships. So this would be superficial charm. Psychopaths often present themselves as charming, engaging, and likable. They use superficial charm to manipulate and deceive others. Grandiose sense of self-worth. They have an inflated view of their own importance, capabilities, and achievements. This grandiosity often leads to a sense of entitlement. Pathological lying. Psychopaths are adept at lying and deceit to serve their own needs and manipulate others. Conning and manipulation. They are skilled in deceit and exploitation, often using others for personal gain without any sense of guilt. If we move on to the affective group of symptoms, these pertain to emotional aspects of psychopathy, particularly how psychopaths experience and express emotions. So, lack of remorse or guilt. Psychopaths often show no genuine remorse or guilt for their harmful actions. They may rationalize or minimize the impact of their behavior on others. Shallow emotions. Their emotional responses are superficial and lack depth. They might experience emotions in a limited and shallow manner, failing to form deep emotional connections. Next is callousness and lack of empathy. Psychopaths exhibit significant lack of empathy and disregard for others' feelings or suffering. Their interactions are emotionally cold and distant. Then we've got failure to accept responsibility for their own actions. So if we move on to the behavioral symptoms, these reflect the actions and behaviors that psychopaths exhibit, particularly in how they manage impulses and responsibilities. So this might be need for stimulation and prone to boredom. Psychopaths often seek excitement and may become easily bored. This need for stimulation can lead to risk-taking behaviors. Parasitic lifestyle, they may rely on others for financial support or exploit others for their own benefit without contributing meaningfully themselves. Lack of realistic long term goals. Psychopaths may lack long term planning and realistic goals, opting instead for short term, immediate gratification or rewards. Irresponsibility, they often display a disregard for responsibilities and obligations, often including financial or social commitments. Poor behavioral controls, they may demonstrate a lack of control over their impulses, often leading to frequent outbursts or inappropriate behavior. Early behavioral problems or juvenile delinquency. Psychopaths may show a history of criminal or antisocial behavior from a very young age. If they've been on conditional release, perhaps that's been revoked. And then criminal versatility. They often exhibit a range of criminal behaviors and may engage in different types of criminal activity over time. And then as we continue to move on, we see that psychopaths may have many short term relationships. They have a history of unstable and short term relationships, reflecting their difficulty in forming and maintaining long-term commitments. And with regard to their sexual life, they're very promiscuous. The Psychopathy Checklist Revised, the PCL-R, is a widely used tool developed by psychologist Robert Hare, used to assess psychopathy in adults. It is considered one of the most reliable and valid instruments for evaluating psychopathy traits and is used extensively in forensic psychology, criminal justice, and research. So, the purpose of the PCLR is designed to measure the presence and severity of psychopathic traits. It is used to assess individuals in, again, various different settings and can help understand an individual's potential for criminal behavior and risk. With regard to the structure, it consists of 20 items, each assessing a specific trait or behavior associated with psychopathy. The items are rated on a scale from 0, 1, or 2. The scores reflect the degree to which each trait is present. The person could get a total of 0 all the way up to a maximum of 40. The diagnostic cutoff there, as you can see, is 30 or greater. The way that we score is a person would get a 0 if the trait is not present or not applicable, a 1 if the trait is present only to a moderate degree, and a 2 if the trait is present to a high degree. The higher the total of the score indicates the higher degree of psychopathic traits. And again, here scores of 30 or more are often used as a threshold to indicate a diagnosis of psychopathy, although the specific cutoff can vary depending upon the context and population being assessed. The 20 items of the PCLR are divided into two main factors, each representing a broad domain of psychopathy. Factor number one, these are those interpersonal and affective traits that we've talked about. So, again, that's going to be that glibness or superficial charm, grandiose sense of self worth, pathological lying, conning and manipulative behavior, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow affect, callous lack of empathy, failure to accept responsibility for their own actions. And then if we flip over to factor two, these are the lifestyle antisocial traits. And again, we've talked about these a bit, but it is need for stimulation or prone to boredom, parasitic lifestyle, poor behavioral controls, promiscuous sexual behavior, early behavioral problems, lack of realistic long term goals, impulsivity, irresponsibility, and criminal versatility. So the PCLR is typically administered through a semi structured interview and a review of collateral information, such as criminal records or psychological reports. The evaluator uses these sources to score each item. The interpretation of the results requires expertise in understanding psychopathy and the context in which the individual is assessed. Scores are used to inform decisions related to risk assessment, treatment planning, and legal proceedings. So, as we're moving on and we're getting more and more into psychopathy, we need to think about and even rethink about this construct. Scheme and colleagues in 2010 conducted a significant review and critique of the field of psychopathy, particularly focusing on the PCLR and its application to forensic settings. The paper titled Psychopathy and Violence, a Review of Literature, was influential in addressing several important issues surrounding the assessment, conceptualization, and implications of psychopathy. So, some critiques of the PCLR. Scheme and colleagues highlighted concerns about reliability and validity of the PCLR, especially regarding its application across different populations and settings. They noted that while the PCLR is a valuable tool, its effectiveness and interpretive value could be influenced by various factors, including the setting in which it's used and population that's being assessed. The paper discussed debates about the factor structure of the PCLR. Uh, this paper pointed out that while the two factor model, the interpersonal affective, and then the lifestyle antisocial, is widely used, and there is ongoing discussion about the best way to conceptualize and structure the traits and behaviors associated with psychopathy. The authors examined the relationship between psychopathy and violent behavior, and they discussed the PCLR's ability to predict violence and noted that while high scores on the PCLR are associated with increased risk of violence, the predictive validity is not uniform across all individuals or contexts. Scheme and colleagues emphasize the importance of considering contextual factors when assessing the risk of violence. They argue that psychopathy should be understood as one factor among many in predicting violent behavior rather than being viewed in isolation. This paper advocated for a broader, more nuanced understanding of psychopathy and suggested that psychopathy should be viewed as a syndrome with a range of possible manifestations rather than a fixed set of traits. They highlighted the need for further research to understand how psychopathy interacts with other psychological and environmental factors. This paper also discussed the implications of their findings for clinical and forensic practice and underscored the need for careful and context sensitive application of the PCL-R and other psychopathy measures. And the paper called for improvements in how psychopathy is assessed and addressed in treatment and risk management. So, let's talk a little bit about the primary and secondary psychopathy. Primary psychopathy is often what we considered quote unquote classic form of psychopathy, and it looks like the core traits of interpersonal and affective deficits. So, the primary psychopathy involves developmental deficits in emotional processing and empathy. Individuals with primary psychopathy exhibit traits such as superficial charm, a grandiose sense of self worth, pathological lying, and a remorse of guilt. These traits are generally seen as stable and enduring, emerging from a combination of genetic, neurobiological, and early developmental factors. These individuals with primary psychopathy tend to have shallow emotional experiences and are emotionally detached from others. They lack genuine emotional connections and exhibit callousness and a profound lack of empathy. Their antisocial behaviors, such as manipulation and deceit, are often consistent and not driven by external stressors or situational factors. They may engage in criminal or exploitive behavior as a result of their personality traits rather than as a response to environmental stress. And then lastly, the research suggests that primary psychopathy may be linked to abnormalities in the brain areas related to emotion and empathy, such as the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. It is thought to have more biological and genetic basis. If we flip over to secondary psychopathy, it is often associated with high levels of emotional reactivity and instability. Traits include impulsivity, emotional dysregulation, and a tendency towards aggressive and antisocial behavior. Unlike primary, secondary traits are seen as more reactive and can be influenced by environmental factors such as trauma and severe stress. Individuals with secondary psychopathy may experience frequent emotional outbursts and exhibit erratic and impulsive behavior. Their emotional responses are often intense and may be linked to personal distress and external provocations. Antisocial behavior in secondary psychopathy are often driven by situational factors such as adverse life experiences or socioeconomic pressures. Their criminal behavior may be more opportunistic and less calculated compared to primary. And lastly, secondary psychopathy is thought to be influenced by a combination of environmental factors, such as exposure to abuse or neglect, and psychological factors, including high levels of stress and instability. So now, as we are rethinking the construct of psychopathy, some old questions may be starting to resurface, such as what is the role of fearlessness or the boldness trait? What symptoms need to be present to constitute a psychopath? And are the affective interpersonal traits sufficient, or are the behavioral traits actually necessary? So, if we take a closer look at some of these questions, let's talk about criminal versus successful psychopathy. Criminal psychopaths are individuals who experience psychopathic traits and engage in criminal activities. Criminal psychopaths are frequently involved in illegal activities, ranging from theft and fraud to violent crime. Their antisocial behavior is often a direct manifestation of their psychopathic traits. They may display high levels of impulsivity and aggression, which contribute to their involvement in criminal behavior. Their actions are often driven by immediate gratification and lack a regard for consequences. As we have discussed, criminal psychopaths may focus on short term gains rather than long term planning. Their criminal behavior is often opportunistic and reactive, driven by their immediate need for reward. Criminal psychopaths are more likely to come from disadvantaged backgrounds or have experienced significant life stressors. Their criminal behavior may be influenced by their environment and personal experiences. Many criminal psychopaths end up in prison or face legal consequences due to their criminal activities. Their psychopathic traits often lead to repeated offenses and difficulty adhering to social norms. Now, if we look at successful psychopaths, sometimes referred to as prosocial or functional psychopaths, these individuals exhibit psychopathic traits but manage to achieve success and maintain a socially acceptable facade. So, successful psychopaths are often people who excel in their careers and achieve high status in their professions and social lives. They may hold positions of power and influence, such as executives, politicians, or entrepreneurs. Unlike criminal psychopaths, successful psychopaths tend to be more strategic and calculated in their actions. They use their psychopathic traits, such as charm, manipulation, and ruthlessness, to advance their goals and maintain a positive public image. Successful psychopaths are often skilled at long term planning and can carefully manipulate situations to their advantage. They're adept at maintaining a facade of normalcy and controlling their impulsive behaviors. These folks come from privileged backgrounds or have access to resources that facilitate their success. Their environment may provide opportunities for them to leverage their traits in ways that lead to professional and social achievement. And successful psychopaths generally avoid legal consequences because their behaviors are less overt and less overtly criminal and more concealed behind the veneer of success and respectability. If you'd like to learn more about successful psychopathy, there is a book called Snakes in Suits: When Psychopaths Go to Work. So that could be some additional reading if that's of interest to you. Let's look at our next question. Is psychopathy a unitary or configural construct? So, the question of whether psychopathy is unitary or configural is a significant one in the field of psychology and specifically forensic psychology. This debate revolves around whether psychopathy should be understood as a single unified construct or more of a collection of different traits and behaviors that may vary in their presentation. So let's talk first about unitary constructs. This perspective views psychopathy as a single, coherent construct that represents a specific type of personality disorder. According to this view, psychopathy is seen as having a single underlying dimension or factor that accounts for various traits and behaviors associated with it. This perspective emphasizes that all psychopathic traits are manifestations of a common underlying pathology. The unitary construct implies that there is a high degree of homogeneity among individuals diagnosed with psychopathy. Despite individual differences, the core traits and behaviors are thought to stem from a unified underlying psychological process. And proponents of the unitary model argue that the core features of psychopathy are consistently observed across different contexts and populations, supporting the idea that psychopathy represents a single integrated construct. Now, the configural construct, this perspective, on the other hand, views psychopathy as a more complex and heterogeneous construct made up of a range of different traits and behaviors. According to this view, psychopathy is seen as a constellation of distinct but related factors and traits. For example, it may include interpersonal, affective, and behavioral components that together make up the psychopathic profile. This perspective is often supported by factor analysis, showing multiple factors or dimensions within the psychopathy construct. The configural model acknowledges that individuals with psychopathy may present with different combinations and intensities of traits. This results in variability in how psychopathy manifests among different individuals. The configural model allows for variability in psychopathy across different contexts and situations. It recognizes that different traits may become more or less prominent depending upon environmental and situational factors. The age old question in psychology is nature versus nurture. And this debate is also in psychopathy as well. And it centers around whether psychopathic traits are primarily a result of genetic and biological factors, which would be nature, or environmental and social influences, which would be nurture. So, in a nutshell, let's look at each of these. Starting with nature, which is the biological and genetic factors. Research suggests that genetic factors play a significant role in the development of psychopathy. Twin studies and family studies indicate a heritable component with certain genetic variations associated with increased risk for psychopathic traits. Abnormalities in brain structures and functions, particularly in the areas related to emotion and impulse control, which are often the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, have been linked to psychopathy. These neurobiological differences can affect emotional processing and behavioral regulation. Some evidence suggests that individuals may be born with a predisposition towards certain temperamental traits, such as high impulsivity or low empathy, which can contribute to the development of psychopathy. Now, if we move over to nurture, this is much more about environmental and social factors. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, such as abuse, neglect, exposure to violence. These can all contribute to the development of psychopathic traits. These environmental stressors can impact emotional development and behavioral regulation. Parenting styles and early socialization processes play a role in shaping psychopathic traits. Inconsistent or harsh discipline, lack of emotional support, and poor attachment relationships can influence the development of psychopathic behaviors. Environmental factors such as socioeconomic status, peer influences, and exposure to crime or instability can contribute to the development of psychopathic traits. And then we have this integrative view. And this contemporary view recognizes that psychopathy results from an interaction between genetic predispositions and environmental influences. So, both the biological and the environmental factors contribute to the development of psychopathic traits, with complex interactions between both nature and nurture shaping the individual. So, in essence, psychopathy is understood as a result of both genetic predispositions and environmental influences, with current research focusing on how these factors interact to shape one's psychopathic traits. And lastly, here we're going to talk about some modern misuses of the concept psychopathy can have very significant implications for individuals and society. So there is a risk of overdiagnosing psychopathy, particularly in contexts where psychopathic traits are misinterpreted or exaggerated. This can lead to labeling individuals who display certain traits but do not meet the clinical criteria for psychopathy. Mislabeling or overdiagnosing can contribute to stigmatization of individuals, leading to unfair treatment and discrimination. It can also affect individuals' access to appropriate mental health care and support. Within the legal context, psychopathy may be misused to justify harsh sentences or deny parole based on flawed assumptions that psychopathic traits inherently predict violent or dangerous behavior, and this can lead to disproportionately severe legal outcomes. Psychopathy assessments might be misapplied or misunderstood in court, leading to inappropriate legal decisions or wrongful convictions. The complexity of psychopathy and its diagnosis can be oversimplified or misinterpreted by those without adequate experience. Also, we need to talk about the media. Media portrayals of psychopathy often focus on sensationalization or extreme cases, contributing to the public's misconceptions. This can perpetuate stereotypes, such as the idea that all psychopaths are violent criminals or that psychopathy is synonymous with a lack of morality. Popular media and fiction often misrepresent psychopathy, creating and reinforcing inaccurate and harmful stereotypes. This can impact public understanding and influence how individuals with psychopathic traits are perceived and treated. And then as we move to clinical settings, there's a risk of using psychopathy as a kind of catch all label for a range of behaviors or personality disorders. And this, again, can lead to misdiagnosis and inappropriate treatment strategies that don't address the person's specific needs. We may also fail to consider the nuanced and heterogeneous nature of psychopathy, which can result in overly rigid treatment approaches that don't account for this complex interactions of this individual's condition. So let's talk more about psychopathic personality disorder because this term is often used interchangeably with psychopathy, though it's less formally defined in clinical settings and compared to the more widely recognized disorders like antisocial personality disorder, which throughout I'm just going to abbreviate as ASPD, antisocial personality disorder. So many of the traits associated with psychopathy do overlap with ASPD, as defined in the DSM-5. However, psychopathy includes additional traits like superficial charm and a specific emotional detachment that are not necessarily required for ASPD. In general, whenever we think about personality disorders, we need to recognize that this is a pattern of inner experiences and behaviors that deviate markedly from the expectations of one's culture. It is inflexible and pervasive, it's stable and long lasting, and it has an early onset. And with personality disorders across the board, we cannot diagnose them before the age of 18. So, when we think about psychopathic personality disorder, these traits include a diminished capacity for empathy or remorse, emotional detachment, or poor behavioral controls. Next, we are going to talk about the interpersonal circumplex model, which organizes interpersonal behaviors and personality traits around two primary dimensions: dominance and affiliation. And first, we're going to look at dominance versus submissiveness. So that is going straight up and down through the circle. Dominance refers to the extent to which an individual exerts control over others. Individuals who are high in dominance tend to be assertive, commanding, and influential. They often take charge in social situations and are seen as leaders or authority figures. They might exhibit behaviors such as directing others, making decisions, and asserting their opinions forcefully. So, an example of this would be a confident leader who guides and motivates a team or a person to take control in a social situation. On the opposite end here, we've got submissiveness, and these individuals are low in dominance. They are more passive and compliant. They tend to yield to others' influence and may avoid taking charge or making decisions. They are often more agreeable and less likely to assert themselves. Here, an example would be a person who follows instructions without question, or someone who avoids conflict and defers to others' opinions. Now, if we look horizontally, affiliation refers to the degree to which an individual is warm, cooperative, and engaged with others. So, on one side, we have friendly. These individuals are high in affiliation. They are warm, empathetic, and cooperative. They seek to build positive relationships, support others, and engage in friendly interactions. They're often seen as approachable and caring. An example of this would be a supportive friend who offers help and encouragement, or a team member who fosters collaboration and positive interactions. On the opposite end, we've got hostile. Individuals who are low in affiliation are more distant, antagonistic, or competitive. They may exhibit coldness, indifference, or hostility towards others and might engage in confrontational or competitive behaviors. An example of someone who's high on hostility is a person who is critical, confrontational, or avoids social interactions, or someone who competes aggressively rather than cooperatively. So now we need to combine these dimensions. So as you can see here, the model plots these traits on a circular plane with dominance going up and down and affiliation going side to side. So we can see that as we move clockwise First, we have friendly and dominant. So this person is high on dominance and high on affiliation. They're charismatic, influential, supportive leaders. They act as a motivating leader who combines assertiveness and warmth and encouragement. Then, if we move down, again, moving clockwise, friendliness and submissiveness. This person is low dominance, high affiliation. They're supportive, cooperative, and agreeable. They provide emotional support and cooperation, often taking a back seat in decision making. Moving over to hostile and submissive. This individual is low on dominance and low on affiliation. They're detached, passive, or indifferent. They exhibit avoidance of engagement and minimal emotional involvement and may appear uninterested or apathetic. And then lastly, we have hostile and dominant. This person's high on dominance, low on affiliation, and the traits that they often exhibit are aggressive, controlling, and competitive. They engage in manipulative or confrontational behavior, often pursuing their own goals at the expense of others. Moving on to the triarchic model. This model was proposed by Patrick, Fowles, and Kruger in 2009. It offers a nuanced and integrated approach to understanding psychopathy by conceptualizing it through three core interrelated dimensions. This model aims to provide a more comprehensive framework for understanding psychopathy beyond the traditional one dimension or two dimensional models. It has three key components. First is boldness, next is meanness, and lastly is disinhibition. So let's look at each of these and how you can see on this slide here, how they map onto the symptoms of the PCL-R. First is boldness. This refers to a personality style characterized by assertiveness, social dominance, and fearlessness. This dimension captures the confident and composed aspects of psychopathy. Individuals high in boldness tend to display an absence of fear in risky or potentially threatening situations, contributing to their ability to remain calm and composed. They display a tendency to seek leadership roles and influence over others, often using charm and confidence to achieve their goals. And interestingly, these individuals often show resilience and an ability to handle the challenges and stress that life throws at them effectively, showing emotional stability and high self assuredness. Now let's look at meanness. Meanness refers to the callous and aggressive aspects of psychopathy, characterized by a lack of empathy, a propensity for cruelness, and a willingness to exploit others. So, individuals who score high on meanness exhibit a profound insensitivity to the feelings and needs of others, leading to exploitation or harmful behavior, a tendency to be aggressive, dominant, or manipulative towards others, often driven by a need for power or control, and an absence of genuine emotional connections, contributing to a cold and calculating approach to interpersonal relationships. And lastly, let's take a look at disinhibition. This captures the impulsive and irresponsible aspects of psychopathy. It reflects a tendency towards poor behavioral control and a lack of consideration for the consequences of one's action. This may look like a propensity to act on immediate desires without considering long term consequences or risks, a tendency to engage in reckless or irresponsible behavior, often disregarding social norms and obligations, and also a difficulty in organizing and planning behavior in a controlled and deliberate manner. So, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about how these are all interrelated. The triarchic model emphasizes these three dimensions: boldness, meanness, and disinhibition are interrelated and together constitute the psychopathic personality. Each dimension contributes to different aspects of psychopathy, and their interactions lead to a variety of psychopathic behaviors. So let's take a look at the concept map of psychopathic personality disorder. This comes from Hart and Cook in 2012, as well as Cook, Hart, Logan, and Michie in 2012. So, this provides a structured and integrated view of psychopathy. It aims to clarify the disorder's multifaceted nature. This concept map synthesizes various aspects of psychopathy into a coherent framework, integrating research findings, clinical observations, and theoretical perspectives. We can see how the domains are broken down. We see dominance, emotional domain, the self, attachment, behavioral, and cognitive. So, a lot of the things that we've been talking about here today, we are further redefining and redefining with each of these different models. So, I hope that you can see that as we've moved through history, we are getting towards a more integrative way of looking at psychopathy and all the various different traits that come together to form this very complex uh, set of traits and behaviors. So you've probably heard about the five-factor model before. It's also called the Big Five of personality traits. It's a widely accepted framework for understanding personality, and it includes five dimensions. You've probably also heard it as OCEAN. So first is openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So, when we examine psychopathy in relation to the five-factor model, it's helpful to understand how psychopathic traits map onto these various different dimensions. So, let's start with openness to experience. This dimension reflects the extent to which an individual is open minded, imaginative, curious, and willing to engage in novel experiences. Research has shown mixed results regarding the relationship between psychopathy and openness. Some studies suggest that individuals with psychopathic traits may score lower on openness, reflecting a preference for routine and a lack of intellectual curiosity. On the other hand, others suggest that high openness might be linked to manipulative and strategic behaviors often seen in psychopathy. So, psychopaths may exhibit low openness in terms of traditional cognitive and emotional experiences, but could potentially display high openness in terms of innovative or strategic thinking. So, researchers are kind of on the fence about this one. Next is conscientiousness. This dimension captures traits such as organization, dependability, self discipline, and goal directed behavior. Psychopaths are generally low on conscientiousness. Most researchers can agree on this. Their behavior is often characterized by irresponsibility, a lack of reliability, poor impulse control, which contrasts sharply with high levels of organization and diligence, typically seen in individuals scoring high on this trait. Low conscientiousness and psychopathy manifests as impulsive actions, disregard for rules, and a tendency to engage in risky or reckless behavior. Next is extroversion. This trait dimension involves social ability, assertiveness, excitement seeking, and positive emotionality. Psychopaths often score high on aspects of extroversion, particularly in terms of assertiveness and excitement seeking. They may exhibit charm, confidence, and a sociable demeanor, which helps them manipulate others and pursue their goals. While they may appear outgoing and charismatic, their high extroversion is typically coupled with a lack of genuine warmth and empathy. Agreeableness. This dimension reflects traits such as trust, altruism, kindness, and cooperation. Psychopaths typically score very low on agreeableness. They tend to lack empathy, exhibit manipulation, and are often deceitful and antagonistic towards others. This low agreeableness is a central feature of psychopathy, influencing their interpersonal relationships and behaviors. Their low agreeableness contributes to their tendency to exploit and harm others without remorse. And lastly, neuroticism. This dimension involves emotional instability, anxiety, moodiness, and vulnerability to stress. Psychopaths generally score low on neuroticism. They tend to be emotionally stable, calm under pressure, and less prone to emotionality and mood swings. This emotional trait allows them to engage in manipulation and risky behaviors without the same level of emotional distress experienced by others. Their low neuroticism contributes to their ability to remain composed and strategic, even in stressful situations. However, similarly to what we saw on the openness scale, neuroticism may also be high, and that may look like people who are very angry or hostile or impulsive. So the research on this one kind of flip flops. So let's wrap it up. The construct of psychopathy is not as well understood as we may think that it is. There's a lot of misconceptions about it, not just among professionals, but definitely among the lay public as well. Some hallmark features of psychopathic personality disorder include diminished affective experience, self centered dominance, and behavioral discontrol. We don't want to confuse the measure with the disorder. A high PCL-R score should worry you, not because it means that psychopathy is present. It doesn't necessarily mean that. But a high score above the cutoff suggests that a person presents with a number of characteristics that, when present in combination, result in increased risk for criminal behavior. So, lastly, let's talk about some assessment considerations. Psychopathy can be a very damning diagnosis. We need to be careful about giving out this diagnosis and how it can be weaponized, as we discussed earlier. At the same time, psychopathic traits are certainly not something that you want to ignore either. Callousness, impulsivity, these are strong correlates of criminal behavior and may have other implications depending upon the referral question, such as treatment planning. So, some central features of psychopathy in and of themselves may not add much to the assessment of risk or reoffense. Other things may matter more whenever it comes to the referral question at hand, and that's why whenever we do our assessments, that they are combining many different factors, such as the interviews with the person, collateral interviews, record reviews, various different things, because we don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket whenever it comes to diagnosing an individual. So thank you for your time today. I hope you learned something about psychopathy, and I'll see you in our next lecture.